Prime Minister has never followed any rules. He does what he wants, and he gets away with it every time. The Prime Minister can't get away with it again. Will the Prime Minister finally do the decent thing and resign, or will his Tory MPs be forced to show him the door?
Being a politician is extremely difficult. Regardless of how fair, transparent, honest, and well-spoken you are, roughly half the population will always despise you simply because both of you have fundamentally different beliefs. Considering this, if you're a politician, you want to make sure that you don't want to piss off the side that supports you, because then you're really screwed. As you can see from the clip though, that's exactly what UK's Prime Minister Boris Johnson has done. Over the past couple of months, Johnson has been flamed by basically everyone in Parliament, including most of the members in his own party. In fact, 27 out of the 31 Scottish Conservative MSPs, or basically representatives, have publicly voiced their disapproval of Johnson. Likewise, Johnson's public approval rating has never been more atrocious. At the peak of his unpopularity, 73% of adults felt that Johnson was performing poorly. Considering this overwhelming negative feedback, many members of Johnson's inner circle have already resigned, like Allegra Stratton. Johnson, however, has bit his tongue and tried his best to at least finish out his term. So here's what happened to Boris Johnson and why the UK is demanding that he resign as Prime Minister. Taking a look back, the root of Johnson's unpopularity can be traced back to March 23, 2020. On this fateful day, the UK government issued a strict stay-at-home lockdown across the country. Restaurants, pubs, and non-essential retailers were all told to close, and citizens were restricted to traveling only to and from essential work. But despite these strict orders for citizens and businesses, it seems like Johnson and the staffers felt that these rules did not apply to them. In fact, many pictures and videos that would eventually be leaked suggest that his inner circle had very little regard for these restrictions. The first example of this was a get-together that took place on May 15, 2020. At the time, the official restrictions stated that people had to maintain 2 meters worth of social distancing, and only a maximum of 2 people from different households were allowed to meet in a public place. Judging from the picture though, about a dozen people were meeting in the garden, no one was wearing masks, and social distancing was basically non-existent. Johnson has insisted that this was simply a business meeting, but the inclusion of his wife and wine in the meeting suggests otherwise. Moving forward 5 days, on May 20th, 2020, Johnson's senior aide Martin Reynolds invited roughly 30 to 40 staff members to a garden picnic. 2 of these invitees were of course Johnson and his wife Kerry, who both attended. Reports suggest that many of Johnson's staff members even advised him that this get-together was in violation of lockdown restrictions. Yet, Johnson attended anyway, and he has denied receiving warnings about the party's violations. Moving forward another month, we have Johnson's 56th birthday, which took place on June 19, 2020. By this point, COVID restrictions had been lightened up a decent amount, and gatherings up to 6 people were allowed outdoors. But for Johnson's birthday, not only did 30 people gather, which is 5 times the permitted amount, but they would gather indoors. Fortunately, UK's COVID restrictions would lighten up even more starting on July 17, 2020. So it seemed like these parties were something that Johnson could leave behind in the rearview mirror. In reality though, the pandemic had just begun. As we now know, COVID cases would pick up once again in late 2020 as the world faced a second wave. As a result, on October 31, 2020, Johnson would announce a second round of strict lockdowns. Just like the first round, restaurants, pubs, gyms, and non-essential retailers all had to shut down for at least 4 weeks. Johnson went on to apologize that Christmas may be very different that year, and that he hopes that taking early action can prevent even more action from being required. Despite this somber speech, just 2 weeks later on November 13, 2020, staff members would reportedly attend a gathering with Kerry Johnson at the Prime Minister's residence. Similarly, just 2 weeks after this on November 27, 2020, a party would be thrown for Johnson's senior aide Cleo Watson, and Johnson would even give a speech at this event. A few weeks later, on December 14, 2020, Johnson's Conservative Party would host a full-on party at their HQ in Westminster. By now, I think you get the gist of what's going on. While the nation was under strict lockdown, Johnson and his colleagues basically just continued on with their daily life. On December 17, 2020, a leaving party was thrown at the Cabinet Office. Similarly, on January 14, 2021, another gathering was hosted to celebrate the departure of two private secretaries. By this point, it was clear that Johnson did not accidentally make a violation here and there. His colleagues and he were consistently violating COVID restrictions week after week. But the nail in the coffin didn't come until April 16, 2021. This time, the Downing Street staff hosted not one, but two parties. Fortunately, Johnson did not attend either of these, and COVID restrictions were much looser by this point as vaccines were pretty readily available. But what made these parties fateful was their ill timing. You see, just 1 week before these parties, Queen Elizabeth II's husband, Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, passed away on April 9, 2021. The funeral was planned for April 17, 2020, which meant the Downing Street parties took place the night before the funeral. For obvious reasons, much of the UK felt that these parties were extremely distasteful and disrespectful. This led to the press looking into the Prime Minister's history with the parties, and their findings would annihilate Johnson's reputation. Over the next several months, the media, along with investigators, would uncover more and more of the parties and gatherings we just discussed, and the public would grow more and more irritated with each discovery. But the piece of evidence that sent the public over the edge was a leaked video of Johnson's press secretary, Allegra Stratton, and a bunch of her colleagues joking about a Christmas business meeting and not following social distancing.
Would the Prime Minister condone having a Christmas?
What's the answer?
I don't know.
It wasn't a party, it was cheese and wine.
Just be clear, it's not.
Is cheese and wine all right?
No.
It was a business meeting.
I'm joking.
This is recorded. This fictional party was a business meeting. And it was not socially distanced.
Shortly after the video was leaked, Allegra would announce her resignation in tears. Many people in the comments have gone on to claim that the tears are fake and that this is terrible acting. But personally, I think the tears are in fact genuine. However, like other comments have pointed out, the tears are likely not because she's sorry for her mistake, but because she got caught and is about to lose her job. After this video was leaked, Johnson had no choice but to conduct an official investigation into the matter. Johnson would initially task Cabinet Secretary Simon Case with conducting the investigation, but he would soon be replaced by civil servant Sue Gray as it was uncovered that one of the parties took place at Simon's own office. Over the next month and a half, Sue would conduct her investigation which uncovered loads of, quote, extremely damning evidence. Sue apparently found dozens of photos showing Johnson attending events with extremely loose or no COVID restrictions. But unfortunately, much of this evidence has yet to be released and it's unclear if it'll ever be released. You see, Sue was supposed to publish her full 25-page report in the last week of January. But on January 28th, it was revealed that Sue's report would only be 11 pages long, and that key details would be left out in order to quote-unquote avoid any prejudice to their investigation. On top of this, Johnson got to review the contents of the reports for 3 days before it was finally published on January 31st, 2022. Unfortunately for Johnson, some of the worst public and political backlash we've seen in modern history would follow soon after. On the surface, it seems like people are pissed off that Johnson didn't take COVID that seriously when it comes to his personal actions. But I think people's distaste for Johnson is much more deep-rooted than him simply not taking COVID seriously. A bunch of world leaders did not take the pandemic that seriously, but they're not receiving the same backlash that Johnson is. And I think the key reason for this is that they were consistent, unlike Johnson. Take Trump for example, he didn't take the pandemic too seriously. He often held massive gatherings at the White House, and he even held a rally with thousands of people in June of 2020. While Trump did receive a lot of criticism from the media and the Democrats, Republicans didn't exactly turn on him because he was consistent with his messaging. Trump's entire premise was that the illness was here to stay and that everyone should return to normal life, including returning to work and school. Whether you agree with this perspective or not is besides the point. The point is that Trump practiced what he preached. Johnson, however, did not. To please the media and a part of the public, Johnson implemented severe COVID restrictions, but in his personal life, he didn't follow any of these. This left quite a sour taste in many British people's mouths as it felt like Johnson and his colleagues thought that they were above the law. While everyday citizens were limited from going to work, attending school, and opening up their local businesses, Johnson was behaving like nothing was happening. What's even more surprising though than the public being upset is that politicians are also upset. All the comments on the initial video I showed you guys are gushing over how crazy it is to finally see a politician being held accountable. And while I agree that it's nice that Johnson's peers are calling him out on his actions, I also think that many of them likely have ulterior motives. Here's the thing, Prime Ministers aren't directly voted for in the UK. Rather, British citizens vote for members of Parliament and the leader of the majority party becomes the Prime Minister. As a result, it's the local elections that determine the national leader. This might be a bit confusing because it's basically the opposite in the US. Americans mainly just vote for a president, and all of their local election choices are just the candidates from the same party. As a result, it's in American politicians' best interest to align with the winning candidate. In the UK though, given that citizens don't vote for the Prime Minister directly, local candidates don't really care about aligning with the Prime Minister. In fact, it would probably be beneficial for them if Boris Johnson is ousted because it gives them a chance to move up. With that being said, Johnson's colleagues turning on him may have more to do with politics than serving justice. But hey, at least he's being held accountable. At the end of the day, Johnson's seemingly elitist view, along with his colleagues' lack of dependence on him, have really torn apart Johnson's reputation. But Johnson has had one saving grace, which is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russia's invasion has turned international attention away from Johnson and onto Putin, Zelensky, Russia, Ukraine, NATO, and so on and so forth. In other words, the severity of Putin's actions has made most people forget about Johnson's actions. Aside from diverting attention, Russia's invasion has given Johnson the perfect opportunity to redeem himself by supporting Ukraine, letting in refugees, and acting as a Western hero in the war.
Refugees, his country's had a historic and proud role in taking refugees.
All of his efforts seem to be paying off, as the distaste for Johnson has noticeably declined over the past 2 months from 73% down to 63%. Johnson still has a lot of work to do to win back support from his colleagues and the public. But given that UK's next general election isn't taking place till May 2nd, 2024, Johnson has plenty of time to do damage control. Also, in terms of resignation, given that Johnson hasn't already resigned, it's extremely unlikely that Johnson will resign due to Partygate, and Johnson will likely just finish out his term. But that's just what I think. Do you guys think Johnson should be fired? Comment that down below. Also, drop a like if you think all politicians need to be held more accountable. And of course, consider checking out our international channels to watch our videos in other languages, and consider subscribing to see more questions logically answered. But until then, I'm Ari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.